My mother called 2 weeks before Thanksgiving to let me know I wasn't invited. That's not how she phrased it, of course. My mother never said anything bluntly when she could say it delicately and still leave a mark. "Sweetheart," she said, her voice warm and careful the way it used to be when she'd tell me I'd tracked mud on the white carpet. "Your father and I are hosting some of his development partners this year. Very prominent people. We thought it might be better if you held off this year. You know how conversations at the table can get." I asked what she meant by that. She paused just long enough to make me understand. "You always end up talking about your little company, and these are men who deal in hundreds of millions of dollars. It might be uncomfortable for you." Not for them, for me. I hung up and sat in my office for a while without moving. Then I opened my laptop and got back to work. While my family passed the cranberry sauce with a table full of real estate developers, I was finalizing a proposal that was about to change everything. The morning after Thanksgiving, my inbox was already flooded, and my family was standing in the lobby of my building. All smiles, dressed like they were headed somewhere important, acting like they'd always believed in me. They hadn't, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Growing up in the Monroe family felt like being the wrong instrument in a very polished orchestra. My father built his real estate development firm from nothing, or so he liked to say. Though nothing, still had a grandfather who bankrolled his first property and a law school buddy who handed him the right contacts. By the time I was in middle school, Monroe Development was a name on every waterfront block in downtown Charleston. His handshake was worth more in this city than most people's resumes, and he knew it, and he liked that he knew it. My mother ran an interior design studio that outfitted the kinds of homes my father's firm built. Their collaboration was good business and good PR. She was elegant in that way some Southern women are, where everything looks effortless and nothing actually is. Her studio appeared in Architectural Digest twice. She kept both issues framed in the front office and made sure anyone waiting for a consultation could see them. My brother went to Duke for undergrad and UVA for law school. He made partner at 33 at a firm that handled mergers and acquisitions for companies I'd read about in the Wall Street Journal. My sister did finance at Georgetown and landed in venture capital in Charlotte by 28, managing a fund, wearing blazers that cost more than my first month's rent, speaking in a register that made everything she said sound like a term sheet. They were, by every measure my family used, exactly what the Monroe children were supposed to become. And then there was me, the youngest, the one who spent high school chemistry genuinely excited about polymer degradation rates, the one who checked out library books on materials science because our school didn't carry them, the one who told my father at Sunday dinner when I was 15 that the biggest environmental threat of the next decade wasn't carbon, it was packaging waste, and watched his face do that slow, patient shift from polite attention to barely concealed disappointment. "That's interesting," he said, and turned to ask my brother about his cases. My grandfather was the only one who didn't look at me like I was speaking a foreign language. He was a retired chemist, 32 years at a paper processing plant outside of Savannah before they downsized and handed him a watch and a pension. He had a workshop in his garage where he still played with compounds in his free time, where it always smelled like acetone and old wood. He was the person I called when I had a question no one else could answer, and he was the one who sat with me at his kitchen table when I was 16 and told me that what I cared about, making materials that could break down instead of sitting in landfills for 500 years, was not a hobby. It was an industry. It just hadn't been built yet. "You'd be building it from scratch," he said, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug, his eyes steady. "That's the hard way. But the hard way is the one that lasts." I held on to that sentence for years, in the way you hold on to the few things that feel true, when most of what you hear doesn't. My family's dinner table had a different vocabulary. Success meant square footage, billable hours, assets under management. What I wanted to build didn't fit on any of their scorecards, and they never pretended otherwise. My mother would ask politely about my interests in a tone that made clear they were interests and not ambitions. My father redirected to my brother or sister whenever I started talking about material science. My brother told me, not unkindly, that there was solid money in environmental consulting if I wanted to do something practical with the science. My sister said venture capital was full of climate tech. Wouldn't I rather invest in it than actually try to build something from nothing? I stopped explaining myself by the time I was 22. It was easier to keep the work separate from the family table than to watch their faces, while I talked about things they'd never think to value. I was midway through a graduate program in materials science at Clemson when I made the decision. My thesis focused on compostable biopolymers, plant-based materials that could replace the plastic film used in grocery packaging. My advisor was enthusiastic. My grant had just been renewed. By every external measure, I was on track. But I kept getting calls from small producers, local farms, specialty food companies, bakeries that had made public pledges to go plastic-free and had no actual pathway to get there. They weren't calling the university. They were calling me specifically because they'd seen a paper I'd published and they needed someone who could make the material, not just study it. I started answering those calls in the evenings, talking them through options that didn't yet exist commercially, explaining what I was working toward. It was the most useful I'd felt in 2 years of graduate school. I left the program in February. I told my advisor first, then I told my family. My father was quiet, which was somehow worse than anger. He set down his fork and said, very evenly, "Lydia, you are throwing away a credential that opens every door you'll ever need." My mother said she didn't understand why I couldn't finish the degree and then do whatever I wanted. My brother asked practically how I planned to fund it without any institutional support. My sister said, and I still remember this exactly, because I wrote it down that night so I wouldn't let myself soften it later. It's cute that you want to be an entrepreneur, but you have no business background and no network. What's your runway? I didn't have a good answer for any of them. What I had was a rented workspace in a light industrial park outside Columbia, a used centrifuge I'd bought from a university equipment liquidation sale, and 6 months of savings. They didn't cut me off financially in any dramatic way. There hadn't been much of a flow to cut. What disappeared was the thing that had still been quietly present in the background. The sense that they were with me even if they never quite showed it. After that dinner, I stopped feeling it. I don't think they noticed it was gone. People rarely notice when a door they never used finally closes. I met Ethan at a clean tech networking event in Columbia that summer. He was an industrial engineer who'd spent 5 years at a packaging manufacturer in Ohio before burning out on making products he believed were part of the problem. We talked for 2 hours in the parking lot after the event ended. He thought the market for compostable packaging was 10 years away from being ready. I told him it was already here. The producers just couldn't find the supply. He asked to see my data. I sent it that night. He replied at midnight with 6 pages of notes and one question at the bottom. Was I looking for a co-founder? We named the company GreenPack Solutions. Ethan said we could rebrand once we had something worth rebranding. He was right, so I let it go. The first year was the kind of difficult that doesn't make for a good story, because it was just relentlessly boring hard. We applied for small business innovation research grants and got rejected twice. We pitched still changed and collected polite emails about not being at the right stage. I kept the lights on by doing materials consulting for an architecture firm that needed sustainability documentation for LEED certifications. Work that paid steadily and that I found almost completely unfulfilling, which is its own particular kind of tax to pay. We ate cheap takeout in the lab. We ran reformulations until I stopped counting which number we were on. My grandfather called every Sunday. He never asked how the money was going. He asked about the chemistry. What were we testing? What had we learned from what broke? He'd done enough materials work in his career that he could follow everything I told him, and sometimes he'd surface a question I hadn't thought to ask, one that sent me back to the bench with a different angle. He was 81. His hands shook a little when he poured his coffee. His mind was the sharpest mind I knew. He passed away 14 months after I left Clemson. Congestive heart failure on a Tuesday in a hospital in Savannah. I drove down that night and sat with my grandmother for 3 days. When I got back to the lab, there was a package on my desk that he'd mailed before he was admitted. A letter, mostly questions about my latest batch test, and at the end, one line in his handwriting. Don't let the people who play it safe define what's possible. I put the letter in the top drawer of my desk. It's still there. Momentum is not a dramatic thing. It's a slow accumulation that suddenly seems to be moving faster than you can account for. We reformulated our primary material 3 times before we had something commercially viable, strong enough to hold product weight, flexible enough to seal properly, shelf-stable for 18 months, and genuinely home-compostable within 90 days. Ethan sourced a manufacturing partner in the Carolinas who could produce at scale. We secured a second-round grant and built inventory. Our first real customer was a regional grocery chain in the Southeast that wanted to pilot compostable produce bags. The pilot performed well. A second chain signed on 6 weeks later. A specialty coffee brand out of Asheville put us packaging within 4 months of our first conversation. A writer at a trade publication ran a piece on us, GreenPack, the startup solving packaging's dirty secret. I printed it and put it in the desk drawer next to my grandfather's letter. Carmen came to us through that article. She ran an impact investment fund out of Charlotte, moved fast, and expected us to hit the numbers we projected. What she offered beyond capital was credibility, and in our market that was worth as much as the check. She wasn't a handholder. She sent monthly questions that required monthly answers, and she didn't let a soft answer slide. I learned to appreciate that. With her backing, we grew to 8 people. Our materials were hitting performance benchmarks better than anything comparable on the market. We were approaching $2 million in annual revenue when a name started appearing repeatedly in conversations with buyers. Northbridge Retail Group. Northbridge operated over 600 grocery and specialty retail locations across the country. Their VP of Sustainability, Sandra Cole, had publicly committed to eliminating virgin plastic from their private label product line within the year. Most of the people I talked to in the industry assumed it was a PR pledge. Aspirational language designed for press releases. I thought Sandra meant it. She had a reputation for meaning what she said, and people with that reputation are the ones worth betting on. I reached out through Carmen, who had a connection at Northbridge's investment arm. It took 3 months to get a meeting. I spent those 3 months building the most detailed proposal I'd ever put together: supply chain projections, pilot data from our regional partners, material performance specs, cost comparisons across 3 different scale points. Ethan kept telling me I was over-preparing. I told him there was no such thing when the right deal was in front of you. The meeting was in October. Sandra was direct in a way I recognized and respected. She spent more time on our failure modes and risk scenarios than on our successes, which told me she was serious rather than shopping for a story to tell. At the end of 2 hours, she handed me 4 pages of technical questions and said, "Send me a revised proposal by mid-November, with specific terms for a national supply agreement and full answers to everything on that list." I was still working through those questions the week before Thanksgiving when my mother called. I remember exactly where I was. Standing in the break room waiting for the coffee to finish, half listening to my phone. Her voice was warm and careful. "The lake house was getting a lot of guests this year," she said. "My father's biggest development partners, their wives, a few people from city council. It would be a formal dinner, not the casual family thing they usually did. Maybe I could come for Christmas instead." I asked if my brother was going to be there. She said, "Of course, my sister, yes, they'd both be there." I stood in the break room for a moment after she hung up. The coffee maker beeped. I poured a cup, went back to my desks, and opened the Northbridge file. I didn't tell Ethan about the call for 3 days. When I did, he was quiet for a second, and then he said, "Okay, so we make this the best Thanksgiving either of us has ever had." He meant the proposal. That was the kind of person Ethan was. The 2 weeks between that call and the holiday were a blur of late nights and technical questions and iterations on costs projections. Carmen reviewed our numbers twice. We pushed our manufacturing partner for written capacity commitments. I was running on 4 hours of sleep most nights, and I didn't mind. Every time I thought about my mother's careful voice, "It might be uncomfortable for you." I went back to the numbers and found another section to strengthen. Thanksgiving morning, Ethan drove to Greenville to spend the day with his parents. Our office was quiet. I made a pot of coffee, ate a granola bar standing over my desk, and worked. At 1 in the afternoon, Sandra emailed. The material performance data was solid. The supply chain structure was sound. But she had a concern. Her team needed flexibility in minimum order quantities during Q4 peaks season, and our current contract structure didn't allow for it. Could we address it by end of day? I called Ethan before I finished reading the email. I've been thinking about this since Tuesday, he said before I could explain. Come back to that section, I think I know how to fix it. He was back in the office by 3:30, coffee in hand. We spent 4 hours rebuilding the contract language, creating a tiered minimum structure that gave Northbridge the Q4 flexibility Sandra needed while protecting our production commitments the rest of the year. Our manufacturing partner's operations manager took a call from Ethan at 6 framework would work. I revised the executive summary. Revised executive summary. Ethan went through every number. I sent the revised proposal at 8:47 p.m. Then I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a while. The way you do when you've done everything you can do, and the next part isn't yours to control. My phone had texts from my mother. Photos of the lake house at sunset, the table set with the good china, my brother and sister with their glasses raised looking at the camera. I looked at the photos for about 30 seconds. Then I put my phone face down on the desk and waited. At 9:53, Sandra's name lit up my screen, not an email, a call. Lydia. Her voice was even. This structure works. I just got off the phone with our procurement lead. We're ready to move forward. Our legal team is sending you a letter of intent tonight. Full contract by end of month. $80 million over 3 years with the tiered flexibility provision we discussed. If your production partner can hit the first delivery in Q1, we have a deal. I don't remember exactly what I said. Something appropriately professional. When I hung up, I sat completely still for about 10 seconds. Then I called Ethan and he made a sound I'd never heard him make, somewhere between a shout and a laugh. And I started laughing too, and we stayed as the phone, saying nothing coherent for a while. I was still in the office at midnight when the alert came through from the Post and Courier's business desk. Charleston's startup GreenPack Solutions announces $80 national supply partnership with Northbridge Retail Group. Sandra's communications team had issued a press release within the same hour as her call to me. Our logo was in the header. My name was in the second paragraph. I sat in the quiet office and read the alert 4 times. I thought about my grandfather in his garage workshop, asking questions about polymer chains while his coffee went cold on the workbench. I thought about the reformulations that failed, and the investors who said not yet, and the clients who asked me to come back when I had more scale. I thought about the nights when I wasn't sure the math would ever work. And then I thought about my mother's voice. It might be uncomfortable for you. I drove home. I slept for 9 hours straight. It was the best sleep I'd had in 2 years. By 8 the next morning, Carmen had already called, her usual reserve replaced with something warmer. A reporter from the state wanted a quote. 3 potential clients had emailed overnight. My inbox looked like it belonged to someone who lived a completely different life than the one I'd been living a week ago. At 9:45, the front desk called back to my office. There are 4 people here, she said. They say they're your family. I knew before I walked out. My father in his sport coat, my mother in the blazer I recognized from a fundraiser photo she'd texted me last spring. My brother, who I knew only showed up when he'd decided something was worth his time. My sister, who I hadn't spoken to in 6 weeks. My father shook my hand, my own father, a handshake, and said, "Lydia, what an announcement. We saw it this morning. You must be so proud." My mother said she'd always known I had something special in me. My sister said her fund had actually had GreenPack on their radar for a while. That last line is what moved something loose in my chest, because that was the tell. Her fund had us on their radar. She hadn't mentioned that in any of the check-in calls we'd had over the past 3 years. The occasional conversations where she'd ask vaguely how things were going, and I'd give a vague answer, because she'd never asked anything specific enough to deserve a real one. But now that there was an $80 million figure attached to my name, her fund had apparently been watching. "You called me 2 weeks ago," I said, "and told me I shouldn't come to Thanksgiving because your guests were too important for my presence at the table." My mother started to say something about the guest list being complicated. "Those weren't exactly your words," I said. "You said it might be uncomfortable for me, but I understood what you meant." I looked at my father. You've been communicating that to me in various ways for years, that what I was building wasn't real enough yet, that I needed to prove something before I could be in the room with people who actually mattered. I looked at my sister. You asked me what my runway was when I left Clemson. You didn't ask me again, not once in 3 years. My brother said carefully, we're here now. You're here because the news made it easy to be here, I said. That's not the same as being there when it wasn't. I looked at my sister again. Her fund had us on their radar. When were you planning to mention that? She opened her mouth. I didn't wait. I built this company over 3.5 years without a single conversation with any of you that lasted longer than 5 minutes before the subject changed. Ethan came back from his family's Thanksgiving dinner to sit in that office with me last night and fix a contract problem in 4 hours. He did that because he believes in this. You believe in the press release. There's a difference. My father said I was being unfair. My mother said we were family and family showed up. Family shows up, I said. Yes, when did you? My sister started to say something about wanting to support me going forward, about what this milestone meant, about how we could move past this and celebrate together. I recognized the shape of that conversation, the one that skips the middle part and lands in a future where they get to stand next to something worth standing next to. I have a call in 15 minutes, I said. You all know the way out. My father's expression did something complicated. My mother's posture tightened in a way I recognized from childhood, the shift she made when she was calibrating her response. My sister, for once, had nothing to add. They left. Ethan handed me a coffee without saying a word. I stood at the front window and watched them cross the parking lot to their cars, and something settled in my chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. I stopped answering their calls after that. Not out of bitterness. I was surprised to find there wasn't much of that left. More because I finally understood that those calls had never really been about me. They'd been about managing the story of me, keeping me at a size that fit into the frame they'd built for the Monroe family. Now that I didn't fit that frame, there was nothing for those calls to do. GreenPack moved into a larger facility in North Charleston in February. We closed a Series A in the spring that put us on the map nationally. By the time summer arrived, we had 23 people on staff and more inbound interest than we could handle without a waitlist. The trade press kept finding new angles on us. I mostly let Ethan and our communicating the interviews while I stayed close to the science and the people doing it. That spring, I started a fellowship program funded by our first year of Northbridge revenue. It placed graduates from materials science and chemical engineering programs in paid positions at climate tech startups, the kind of ground-level unglamorous work that changes what's possible in an industry, but rarely gets any glory. I named it after my grandfather. At the announcement event, I held his letter and didn't read from it. I knew what it said, and I didn't need to perform it for anyone. The first fellow was a 22-year-old from Georgia Tech who'd been told by her department chair that commercial biopolymers were a dead end. I told her the chair was wrong and that we'd need her in the lab by June. The thing I got most wrong in those early years wasn't anything about the science or the business. It was the belief that the people who should have been in my corner would eventually come around. That I was building a case, gathering evidence, and that one day I'd get to present it to the people whose opinion I'd been raised to believe mattered most. I spent real energy on that case. I built it carefully, without meaning to, over years. When I finally had more evidence than anyone could reasonably dispute, I understood that the verdict had never actually been theirs to give. My grandfather knew that. He told me in different ways, across different kitchen conversations for years. I understood it intellectually for a long time before I understood it in the way that changes how you move. It took 3.5 years of building something real, mostly without them, sometimes in spite of them, always for reasons that had nothing to do with them, before it became something I knew in my body instead of just my head. My family lost me not because I stopped trying to reach them. They lost me because they could never see me clearly enough to know what they had.